Hello, this is a new article on ACCA, Advanced Auditing and Assurance for Auditing Work Papers. This article is downloaded from home section of your student study resources advanced auditing technical article audit working papers. This article is about the working papers. Auditors should prepare and organize their working papers in a manner that helps the auditor to carry out the appropriate audit services. The auditor should avoid preparing or accumulating unnecessary working paper. That is, they should not prepare the working paper which are unnecessary and should also avoid making extensive copies of the client's accounting record. This article is at both level, that is audit and assurance, at F level, and for P level advanced auditing and assurance. The auditing standard ISA 230 audit documentation state that the objective of the auditor is to prepare documentation that provides a sufficient and appropriate record, also evidence that the auditor has planned and performed during the course of audit shall be documented. That is, those evidences which the auditor has gathered based on your ISA and legal regulation framework, they shall document it. However, the care shall be taken that useless documents shall not be made and unnecessarily accounting records of the client, that is the extensive copy, shall be avoided by the auditor. So moving with this article on advanced auditing and assurance ACCA for audit working papers. Well, the audit working papers are the documents in regards of the client businesses, the nature of the client, the timing, extent of the audit procedures being performed, knowledge of the business such as business processes, products, services, which will be helpful for the auditor to gain extensive knowledge of the client in the course of audit. Any risk controls are available, internal controls. This information which percolates to the financial statement, other income, due diligence, audit working, that is your internal control should also be documented. Also, the auditor should have a proper supporting so that they will be able to place a conclusion on the financial statement through their opinion in the auditor's report. These working papers are very important because it serves as an evidence in the court of the proceedings if any action against the company is taken, and if that is not being available in the auditors, then the auditor can be able to say that they have performed a necessary appropriate audit evidence and they were unaware, and however they had a professional skepticism and they tried to do their audit procedures well planned. There was a proper scope, so it's like a legal proof which the auditor can substantiate if any legal proceedings is on the company, that is the client. This working paper can be either current working paper or permanent working paper. Current working papers means the day-to-day audit observations, including the correspondence relating to the acceptance of the annual reappointment. The current working paper also include the extract of important matters in the minutes of the board meeting and general meeting as relevant in the course of audit, so that this will be helpful for the auditor to gather the evidence. And these are current because they keep on changing, that's why they are appearing in your current file. Again, the evidence is in respect of the planning processes during the course of audit, that is whenever the audit is going to commence, there is a planning meeting set between the audit team and the partner managers. So these are all evidences. Then the analysis of the transaction and balances. Then during this meeting, if the auditor find that any error or any negative opinion was being given in the previous year's audit report, then again that has to be linked so that their care will be taken properly. Again, the analysis of the transaction records the nature, timing, extent of the audit procedures performed, and the results of such procedures. The current working file also includes the evidences work performed by the audit team. There should be proper supervision and review of the work performed. There should be adequate copies of the communication between the auditor and the expert or the third parties. Like whenever there is any complex area, the auditor appoints an expert, or if there is a management appointed expert, then the communication is to be documented, which appears in your current file. Again, the current file also include a letter of representation or confirmation. Like during the course of audit, if the auditor has obtained or seek from the client permission the written representation from the banks or the creditors, debtors, or the third party, whosoever, then this comes under your properly documentation, which is maintained in your current working file. This confirmation are required so that they will understand whether the balances are proper and they are reflecting true and fair view, that is they are accurately booked in the client's record, client's financials. This also include the letter of representation. Then sometimes the auditor might found or reach to the conclusion, so these are also important, and these are in regards to the significant aspect of the audit, including the manner. Also, this current working file include the copies of the financial information which is being reported or it was under the audit report. Now moving with the permanent audit working file. These are the permanent audit working file, means this information doesn't keep on changing, like the structure of the organization of the company, MOU, articles of association, like the information concerning the legal and organization structure, like how the organization is, the legal structure, the organizational structure of the entity, because this doesn't keep on changing day to day. Like again, there might be as informed that memorandums of association and articles of association, these are the important charters of the organization based on which the organization is being set up. They contains the objects like name clause, capital clause, and other clauses. The permanent working file also include the extract of copies or important legal documents or agreements or the minutes of the audit. They also include the record of the study and the evaluation of the internal controls, because internal controls plays a very important role in the finance and the financial statement, and the finance is a part of the financial statement. Also, the copies of the audited financial statement of the previous year, if there are any significant ratios and trend. Then the management letters copies which the auditor obtains from the client, and there was a proper communication between the retiring auditor when the new auditor is being appointed. In such cases, these are your permanent working file. Also, it includes the notes regarding the significant accounting policies. The significant accounting policies adopted by the client, and if there are any significant audit observations, these are your permanent working file. So basically, this working papers is the ownership of the auditor, and these documents helps the auditor in the as a proof that they have performed the audit properly as per the generally accepted auditing procedures, essays, IFRS, other compliances, legal law, rules, regulations. The forms of working paper. The working paper have to be of the proper area. They have to be of the complex coverage. If there are any risk of material misstatement, then this forms the part of working paper. Again, if there is any evidence which are significant, the auditor has to document them in their working paper. Also, the nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures, along with the audit, these are the important areas which forms the part of the working paper. Moving with the content of the working paper, it includes the client business nature. If there are any meetings between the team and the client, then these are also to be form part of your working paper. During the course of audit, the auditor obtains sufficient appropriate audit evidence in regards to the client processes being followed, audit programs, is there any internal audit, their work, their independence, their evidence is obtained, their assumptions being taken. There should be a proper supervision and a work review. Also, in the working paper, it includes like the significant ratios, like ratio analysis, trend analysis. What are the different kind of transactions are all being recorded in your working paper. The working paper also include the identification and assessment of the risk of material misstatement, the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedure. It also include the indication as to who and when the audit procedures was being performed. That is the team who has performed, when it was being performed, how it was being performed, who reviewed it. Everything has to be documented so that it will be ease in doing their audit, as well as if they are appointed in the subsequent years, then it will be helpful for them to have a proper working being ready, and this will be helpful in their audit planning between the engagement partner and the management. It will also include the results of the audit testing on several expenses, incomes, assets, liabilities. Like whenever the audit is done, they have to review your all the expenses, all the figures which forms the part of the financial statement, balance sheet, profit and loss, trial balance, statements, disclosures. And it also includes your notes to the account. Then any working is being done, then that all working has to be properly reviewed and they are properly documented. This forms the content of the working paper. Also, in the review of the working paper, auditor helps the auditor in reaching to the audit conclusion based on the evidence is obtained and when they are properly documented, so that if the auditor is giving any adverse opinion, then it affects the reliance, then it brings the questions why this auditor has given this opinion. So in such cases, in order to avoid the conflict, this working paper are required, on which the auditor can prove how the audit was being performed and basis of which the opinion was being negotiated. It will also include the audit working paper shall be reviewed by the experienced team members, other persons, and if anyone wants to review this working paper, a proper consent of the auditor has to be obtained, and later the other parties, if the auditor approves, they can take the copies, extract of the working paper, take the notes of the working paper. Also, the audit work, it helps to prove that the auditor was performed, the significant and evidence is all being obtained, on which the basis of the opinion is being there in your audit report. The benefits of working paper, it is like a quality control. Like whenever any quality control is being performed by or any review is being performed by the local authority or the other partners who are the peers, then it will helpful as a checklist in the course of audit for this person, that is the peer and the local authority. Also, if there any negative opinion being taken, then this against the company, and the auditor was not aware of it, then it will also help the auditor to substantiate in front of the legal evidence if asked why the auditor has given the clean opinion, because it might happen that they were not brought to the notice of the auditor, or the auditor was not aware, though they have performed the proper audit procedures. Because what happens that auditor is gives a reasonable opinion, those opinion cannot be 100% assured, and the audit is performed based on the sampling, based on the materiality level, and whatever the evidence which the auditor think perfect, this cannot be 100% right. And that's why, in order to protect their interest and to be away from the negligence, that is the professional negligence, and in order to protect themselves from the fines penalties, this is considered to be a supportive evidence. So these are the working paper which are very important, and they records everything whatever the auditor thinks perfect in the course of audit. Proper test controls were being performed, proper reporting procedures were being there, all the assertions which the auditor think perfect are being performed in the course of audit, and documenting the papers obtained from the audit client as well as the third party. It will help the auditor to be reliable evidence. Like this, the reliability of the evidence, if it is obtained by the auditor, it is the prior than the third party evidence. That is, the audit evidence is considered to be a more reliable evidence than that obtained from the third party. And client, that is the management evidence obtained, that is the evidence obtained from the client or the management, is less reliable than the third party evidence and the audit evidence. So here we can see that in the course of the audit, reliability of the evidence is much more on the audit evidence. At the second place, it is the third party evidence, and at the third place, it is the client evidence, because the management of the, that is the client, is pressurized sometime to show the good position, and that's why they may manipulate, and it may affect the evidence obtained. The audit evidence is more reliable because it is directly obtained by the auditor in the course of audit based on the assertions, a proper review, and the proper documentation of the evidence. They have to check whether the objectivity principles of the ethics, like they are meant to maintain independence from the client, professional objectivity, professional behavior. They should have proper knowledge. That's why they are considered to be more reliable than the audit, than the client. So these are some of the benefit of the working paper. Moving to the article, it is explaining the same thing, that the audit documentation states that the objective is to prepare the documentation that provide a sufficient appropriate audit evidence and the record of the basis on which the auditors report, and the evidence that the auditor was planned and performed in accordance with the ISA and legal rules regulations. There was a proper nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedure performed to comply with the ISA legal rules regulation. A proper results of the audit and the evidence obtained. if there are any significant matters, then that has to be discussed so that a proper conclusion can be reached and a judgment can be made in reaching the conclusion. Also, documentation has to be maintained by the auditor in respect of the characteristic of the specific item or matters that are being tested. The auditor should document discussion of significant matters with management and others on a timely basis. Suppose if the auditor has identified information that contradicts or is inconsistent with the auditor's final conclusion regarding the significant matter, then the auditor should document how the auditor assessed the contradiction or inconsistency in forming a final conclusion. That is, if there are any deviations between the audit evidences and later if any information which has been obtained there is a contradiction, then the auditor should document that how the contradictions happen and why they are inconsistent with each other before deciding the final conclusion. Also, in certain cases, these are exceptional circumstances, the auditor judges it necessary to depart from the basic principle or essential procedure that is relevant in the circumstances of the audit. That the auditor has to comply with the principles, procedures, and if there is any departure from this principle and procedure, and these are relevant in the course of audit, then the auditor should document them and should also document what are the different other alternative audit procedures which were being performed by them, so that they have to maintain the objectivity of the audit. Else it will be clear why it will create a doubt why they have escaped. So they have to properly inform that there is a departure and they have to inform why it is a departure and what other additional procedures which were being performed, so that the objectivity of the audit is achieved. And unless otherwise clear the reasons for the departure, why they, in documenting the nature, timing and extent of the audit procedure performed, the auditor must record the identifying the characteristic of the specific items of matter tested. They should also document and perform the audit work and date of such work was being completed. That is, the auditor should identify the characteristic of the specific item or matter tested. What are the different matters? They should also perform the audit work and the date of when the work was being completed. Also, like here I have shown you who has performed it, when it was being performed. This all the same thing has been covered. That is, they have to document the team who has. Suppose in the case that which is exceptionally that arises sometimes, that the auditor's report has been given and after the date of the auditor's report they require the auditor to perform new or additional audit procedures, or some events has happened that led the auditor to reach the new conclusion, then in such case the auditor should document the circumstances which arise, the new or additional procedures to be performed, and the audit evidence required to be obtained, and conclusions which are dealt in the course of the audit, and their effect on the audit report. Also, they have to suggest and required by whom and when the resulting changes for their documentation were made. That is, they have to state the circumstances that arise or new or additional audit procedures that are required along with the evidences to be obtained the conclusions reached, and the effect of auditor's report. Also, they have to search that by whom the resulting change is, how the audit to be documented, when to be documented, so on, so that it will be helpful for the review. And this documentation is required so that the auditor will protect themselves from unwelcome and unnecessary litigation which arise. Now moving with the importance of the working paper. The working papers, as discussed earlier, that the benefits, quality control, review, send sufficient appropriate audit evidence, recording, testing, reporting. So here we are starting with this article, what the examining team is suggesting. So these are necessary for the audit quality control process. That is, the audit is performed as per the required quality control parameters set. Also, it provides the assurance that the work delegated by the audit partner is properly performed, is properly completed. It will help the auditor to provide the evidence that effective audit has been carried out, that the audit has been performed effectively, efficient audit. It increases the economy, effectiveness, and efficiency of the audit. It contains sufficient appropriate details during the course of the audit which the auditor has obtained, and that's why these are documented in your working paper. Also, it helps to update the facts which justify the reasonableness of the auditor's conclusion. That is, when I say informed that whenever the auditor is giving an opinion, so these working papers are the basis on which the opinion was being given by the auditor, to check the conclusion were correct, appropriate, and their reasonableness. Also, the auditor are required to retain the proper records of matters, so that if they are of significant, this also increases the economy efficiency as discussed, the sufficiency of the detail which the auditor has obtained, gathered in the course of audit. It will also help the auditor to be updated of the facts which help to understand the reasonableness of the auditor's conclusion reached, that they are correct, they are reasonable. Also, any record which the auditor is required to retain in the course of audit for containing the future audits is to be documented. Now, avoiding the unnecessary paper content. So, we have understood the importance, as well as up to now we were discussing about the importance of the working paper, the form, content. However, as I informed you earlier, that in unnecessarily this working paper should not be obtained. That is, the client record shall be documented only and only when the auditor feels that it is necessary or it is essential, or they are useful for the purpose of the auditor's report, or it will be useful for any other matters like taxation matters, legal matters, having the client understanding about the statutory and regulatory requirement it is for the auditor to hold such documents. And suppose if it is not irrelevant, then the auditor should not document them. So this is very important. So suppose if the documents are of public in nature, that is, it is not practicable, it is not practical to hold these separately, and it is a regular routine of the management to make them, then it is not a separate thing that it will give any value addition. So in the such case, it is not required to have this paper. Now moving with the content. The content of the working paper should name the client, because for the working paper is like a paper, and it should contain the name of the client, the period for which the audit was being done, the subject matter of the working paper, If there are any other files, then a proper link or proper reference should be given. There should also be initials or signature of the members of staff who prepared this working paper, and the date when they signed off, when they prepared, should be the content. Also, in sometimes the cases are happening that the paper prepared by the client staff, it should not having that name, so they should take the care of it that it should be properly named, the properly dated, so that it will be helpful for the auditor to check that this audit working papers are for this period. Else how they will be understanding, because they might be having not one client, they will be having many clients, and to know each other, each this doc filing becomes very big, cumbersome, and that's why these are very important. Who signed it, any references to any matter, then the subject matter, then the period covered, because this client can also be happening in your future audits, that is the future financial years, with the same auditor, and so that's why they are required to date it. Also, it must contain the initials of the member of the staff who reviewed the working papers. As I informed, this working paper should be reviewed by the senior or experienced persons, and it should be provided in the law, rules, regulations, based on the auditor's permission. In certain cases, it is required that if it is asked by during the course proceeding. Also, each working paper should meet the characteristic of good working paper. Now moving with the paper prepared by the client. It is seen that in sometimes what happened, the management, that is the client, prepares or arranges these working papers which are required to be written by the auditor. So in such cases, the auditor should agree the form of the working paper with the client staff at any early stage in the audit, so that it will be helpful for them to know what is the form of the working paper, details mentioned in the working paper, and this should be included in this information in the audit timetable. That is, it will be helpful for the auditor in his audit, which is a time based activity, and this will be helpful to check by the auditor. These documents can be arranged by this either by the auditor or made or prepared by the client, and by this way this the auditor can obtain the copies or the extracts and make them in their file. Also, the auditor is required that while arranging this working paper, a proper care is given to the information which they required and is stated, and it's showing the true and fair view. It should not happen that a working paper is obtained but the information mentioned in this paper is falsified. The adequate care is required by the auditor in the course of audit to get that this information is correct. There should be proper identification procedures that those working paper which are being arranged by the client, they are separately be identifiable. Because what happened, as informed, that this evidence obtained by the auditor directly is more reliable than your third party evidences and the client. So there should be a proper separation and identification that the evidence has been obtained by the client or it was being obtained directly by the audit procedures by the auditor, and there should be separately identification. A member of the audit staff is responsible for the audit area of the working papers he or she has prepared in the course of audit, and there should be a proper sign by those who have arranged it and those who have reviewed it, so that there will be an evidence that these are being checked and these are being verified, that is by the manager and the partner and the subsequent reviewers. there should be a signature of the audit team member indicating that the working paper file has been properly audited if it is prepared by the client staff. Some characteristic of good working paper. Well, this working paper should clearly state the audit objective, usually in terms of the audit assertion. Like sometimes it is like to ensure the completeness that they are correctly showing the figures. It should be meeting the audit objectives. The audit objective is to give the reliance, objectivity in the financial statement, whether they are being prepared correctly or not. And that's why the good characteristic of this working paper is that they should be clear with the audit objective in terms of the assertion. As informed earlier, the audit working paper should contain the year, the period, and like for example, if the period is for 31st October, then it should contain that the year as well as the period, so that it will be able for the auditor in understanding for what file he has obtained pertaining to which year. It may happen, and it is done so that there will be no confusion, because the date is very important as well as the year. It should also state the full extent of the test, that is what was being tested, how many times it was being tested, what was the sample area, how the number was being determined, considering the materiality. As this will be helpful for the auditor to know about the sufficiency of the audit evidence in the sort of this working paper being prepared. Sometimes it is happening that this working paper contains information which is linked or referred to the other working papers. So in this case, there should be a proper reference should be given of the other working paper, and it should also state the details of the items, activities that are being tested in another working paper, whether they are sufficient or not. This working paper which are being prepared should maintain the ethical code of conduct. That is, they should be objective, there should not be any unbiased, there should be honesty, integrity, and there should not be falsified. The correct facts should be documented. It should also consist of the conclusion reached which are consistent with the result of the test and should be able to withstand independent scrutiny. Like whenever any review or the scrutiny is going on, it should support the conclusion. So that is very important. Sometimes this working paper require the reference of the others. So this working paper should also state and be referred so that it will be helpful, and there should be proper space, or they should be properly stored this working paper so that it will be helpful even at the later date. If any haphazard things are going, then there should be maintain a proper lean system so that this working papers will be served even at the future date. There should be proper signature of the person who prepared it, so that if any queries are there, it can be directed with the concerned person. It should also be signed and dated by any person who reviews it, so that it will be able to meet the quality controls requirement of the review. So these are some of the best practices, you may say, the characteristic of the good working paper. Like it should be state the objectives, the audit assertion. It should consist of the year and the date, the period for which they are required. It should also be containing the full extent of the test performed, so that there will be assurance of the appropriateness and the sufficiency of the audit evidence. if any reference is required, then there should be properly referred, and it should be stated so that it will be helpful for the persons who are going through it to review them. It should also be clear, and it should state the objectivity of the results of the test. Whatever is being tested, it should be proper. Objectivity should be maintained. It should also reach to the conclusions. The working paper should have the proper reference to the file and should be found even at the later date. Then it should be signed by the person who prepared it, also by the person who reviewed it, so that there will be proper quality control requirement, as well as there will be proper directions in place in the future. And suppose if this quality is not being maintained, or if any relevant characteristic is absent of from this, then it should result into audit review point. And later the examiner also concludes. So this is your end of the article.